A recent study done with multiple sclerosis patients yielded a surprising result. Researchers wanted to figure out which was the better of two therapies in this study, counseling by experts or counseling by peers. And so they took a group of multiple sclerosis patients and they trained 5 of them to be peer counselors. Then the researchers broke the rest of the group in half, more than 100 people. The first group went to a monthly support group to learn tips on coping with MS from outside experts. The second group was mentored on coping skills by these 5 trained peer counselors. Now, while the idea was to find out which of these two groups was more effective, those taught by outside experts or those taught by peer counselors, that's not what happened. Researchers found that the group that did far and away better than these two groups was a third group. The group of 5 trained peer counselors whose depression and self-confidence and self-esteem all improved markedly as they engaged in healing acts of teaching, encouraging, and counseling those other MS patients. Caring for others had brought healing for the caregivers. The main researcher summed up the findings quite profoundly. He said this: these peer counselors had undergone a spiritual transformation that gave them a refreshed view of who they were. Well, good morning, everybody. You and I are in the Gospel of Mark that Ray just read for us. We're in Mark chapter 1, and that's where we were last week when Jesus performed his first miracle. Remember, he cast out a demon from a man in the temple. And today, Jesus is up to it again. He's healing St. Peter's mother-in-law, then he's healing all sorts of people and casting out even more demons. Here we make note that Jesus spent, have you ever tallied this up? Jesus spent 2/3 of his earthly ministry involved in healing and deliverance of some sort. Wow, 2/3 of his ministry. This is the work of the Jesus you and I have pledged to follow. He healed, and we're to heal. Well, why? Well, in light of that study of MS patients that I just went through with you, we can see that Jesus wants us to imitate him, not simply because he wants to heal the sick, but because he wants to heal the healers as well. Perhaps Jesus knew that when we who are in need of healing reach out to help those who are hurting, we too can undergo a spiritual transformation, giving us a refreshed view of who we are. Transformation, change, changing our minds, changing our habits. Those who study habits point to neuroscience, and they explain that much of our everyday activity is based on a cycle of cues and routines and rewards that form well-worn pathways in our brains, which in turn make up the majority of our human existence. You know, what we'll do today is basically what we did yesterday. Think about the morning rituals of getting up out of bed, reading, perhaps praying, making the coffee or whatever. Most of the stuff we don't even think about. It's habit. It's what we're used to doing. When we are in our routines, we have a particular point of view that we're used to. It's actually quite literally a well-worn rut, and we don't readily abandon it. But when we purposely change a habit, get out of that rut, in this case, put ourselves in the place of another, as these caregivers did, we no longer see things the same way. The neural pathways in our brains are altered. We see things we hadn't seen before. And friends, this is the soil from which transformation appears. In Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, a high society woman is not well. She's lost her faith. So she asks the wise spiritual leader to help her out. How can I believe in God again, she asks. How can I feel God's love? The spiritual teacher says, well, the answer is simple. If you want love, you must give love. Go, try, and love your neighbors. Love them actively. Love them unceasingly. Love your family. Love your friends. And as you love them more and more, you will be more and more convinced of God and of God's love. You will undergo a spiritual transformation and be given a refreshed view of who you are. Now, in this case, the high society woman was able to connect more readily with the love that is in her heart by changing her perspective, by looking in from the outside, seeing things differently, and thus she went through a transformation. Isn't that why you and I are here this morning? An author I like uses very interesting vocabulary around this paradigm, and he says this, that you and I, we all have an automatic self. How do you act when you're not thinking about how you act? When nobody is looking, when you're just doing what you're doing? Well, that's your automatic self. He then asks an important question. Has your automatic self changed since you were a kid? Hopefully it has. And if so, this is all the proof that you and I need to conclude that the automatic self is not a given. It isn't hardwired. Those neural pathways are malleable. So whatever unwanted habits, harmful routines, and unhelpful cycles you and I may be in this morning, it's not permanent. Many of us came to church hauling with us a tractor trailer full of these things. Some because that's where we are, others because, hey, it's still COVID, right? And the healing liberation we see Jesus bringing about in the gospel is exactly what he wants to do in your life and in mine. Jesus wants us to be liberated, transformed, healed. It is possible. Change can happen. That is what the good news of the gospel is all about. If we take this notion of the automatic self seriously, we understand these very challenging habits that we're trying to reform. We understand that they can be changed. They change from practice. They can change slowly or quickly. But changing, then, is a skill. We can learn to be the authentic version of ourselves we'd like to live with, and the message we get this morning is that intentionally seeking to heal and liberate and restore and assist others can bring about transformation within ourselves. You know, my friend, Ed, he was very smart, but he was very shy and he was very lonely in high school. And it was our freshman year, and he'd moved in from a different school district just a year previously, so he really didn't have any friends at school. But Ed had gotten to know our friend Steve, who had more friends than anybody. And one day Ed let his guard down. We were at lunch at the cafeteria, sitting there at the table, and Ed asked Steve a personal question, not easy to do in the peer-pressured high school years, and he asked him, Steve, how have you garnered so many friends? Easy, Steve said. If you want a friend, you have to be a friend. He explained that he too had tendencies to feel shy and feel lonely, and that most people do. However, most people also appreciate authentic, friendly people in their lives. And that's why Steve said he intentionally reaches out. He finds that most often people are receptive to friendships, and as long as he was genuinely caring and proactive, issuing invitations, making phone calls, most people treated him the same way in return. Perhaps Jesus knew that. In doing so, in reaching out to heal loneliness, we would be healed and undergo a spiritual transformation to give us that refreshed view of who we are. You know, I used to have a secretary, not here at St. David's, but I had a secretary who answered the phone kind of like she was tied up in a dungeon. Hello? And what was so off-putting is that he was a church secretary. And when you got to know him, you discovered that a kinder, gentler, more Christian man you couldn't find. I don't think he had any idea how far removed his public persona was from what we all knew lay in the inner recesses of his jolly, thankful heart. For many of us, the deepest convictions of our hearts are similarly hidden and not on full display. We have a hard time shining that joyful light and being that hopeful beacon because of the habits that we've gotten into. Now, certainly the culture's to blame. You know, I was in New York City recently, as many of you know, and I made it a habit. I was gonna smile at pedestrians like a good old Midwestern boy. And you know what? It's true. Nobody smiled back. It's just the way it is. We too have similar mores of going through the world. And like my former secretary, we too have a hard time expressing that contentment, that gratitude, that joy that we know dwells in our heart of hearts, because that's how we've been conditioned as well. Just think about all the blessings we have this morning. I know a lot of us are in different places, but as St. Paul talks about the food before us, the house, the roof over our heads, to be joyful and to look at the ways that God has certainly blessed us. In 99% of our situations, we can find a reason to be thankful, to give thanks, and to be grateful. But often we don't because we're out of the habit. We haven't been in that habit of counting those many, many blessings around us. Many of us are more cued into our habits of frustration and anger and sadness and cynicism. It seems we have more cultural tendencies towards these habits of woe than we do towards well-being. Well, these attitudes are expressed when a car cuts us off in the morning commute, or an opinion is expressed that offends us. But as we've been talking about, these are not immutable. We can find ways to get out of our ruts. And if there's an invitation to today's gospel, friends, it's this as I wrap up here. Follow Jesus' example of tending to other people, preferably in the areas in which we most need healing. And we, my friends, can experience that liberation, that freedom, that transformation. You know, there's an old saying, whatever we pay attention to is what will grow. Whatever we pay attention to is what will grow. What are we paying attention to this morning? Are we surprised that it's growing? As we attempt to get our minds off of our own challenges and pain, as we endeavor to heal, to liberate, to restore the brokenness of those around us, as we purpose to cure the ills of others, herein we may find what we need to heal ourselves. Amen.